Welcome to tutorial on the TipTop Audio Quantizer Eurorack module. The quantizer is a module that will convert a series of voltages into discrete musical pitches. So for example, if you feed it a sequencer, an LFO, or any kind of control voltage source, it'll make sure that the notes that it outputs fit into some kind of Western musical scale that you can customize. So let's get started. All right, here's a quantizer module right here. Let's just quickly go over the front panel knobs and switches and buttons and just get a quick overview, and then we'll deep dive on some of the concepts here. So starting from the top here, we have two CV inputs, one labeled note CV, one labeled scale CV. Note CV is your main input. This is where you're going to feed the CV signal that you want to be quantized. Scale CV can be configured to either control scale or transpose via some external CV signal. Down here you have your volt per octave output. This is your main output, which is going to be quantized. So you feed a random CV signal in here, and you get a quantized output here, which you can feed into an oscillator. And over here we have a reset input, and this is used to reset the playback or the record head back to step one, because the quantizer also has a mini sketchpad so you can record little melodies. And down here we have a clock input. So this is dual purpose. You can either use it to clock quantizing, so you can switch the quantizer to a mode where it'll only quantize notes when the clock signal comes in. And the clock input is also used for the record feature. So as you're recording notes, every time it gets a clock, it'll record a new note. That's it for the jacks. Let's move on to some of the buttons and concepts here. So over here on the right, you can see a bunch of buttons and lights. And you can see these green backgrounds here. Basically, this is a mini keyboard. So if you look from here, you get a little C, C sharp, D, etc. This also serves to select various different menu items, which we'll go over later. But this primary function is the function as a keyboard. Over here, you have octave lights. So these will light up depending on one of the 5 octaves that are currently being played. And over here, we have a slider. So this is a unique feature of this quantizer. The slider can control a bunch of different parameters just like the keyboard can. And over here you have 2 sets of menus. The first one determines what the keyboard does. The bottom one determines what the slider does. And you can just cycle through those with these buttons here. The modes for the keyboard real quick are keys, in which you can just play notes directly with these buttons here and it'll be output here. You have scale edit. So a scale is basically a selection of notes that will be quantized. So scale edit allows you to toggle and change the different notes in the scale. Transpose allows you to transpose via some interval. And input range is sort of a general settings menu. So once you enter input range, all these buttons have a little label here on the left that indicate different kinds of settings you can set. And we'll go over those later. Similarly for slider, you have different modes that control what the slider does. Notes turns the slider into just a general note picker. So you can play notes with the slider and it'll go across all the octaves. Portamento allows you to introduce lag between notes. So as you increase this, as notes switch from one to the other, you'll get a bit of a slew going there. Finally, here we have transpose. It turns the slider into a transpose knob, fairly self-explanatory. Similarly, octave, so you can use this slider to shift octaves. And finally, input range, which puts the slider into a sort of a setting selector, so you can select the voltage range for the incoming input. And for that, you can select things like 0 to 10 volts, 0 to 5 volts, or bipolar from -5 to 5 volts, depending on what kind of input you want to feed into here. And over here in the middle, we have a cluster of these little buttons here. So some of them are related to each other, some of them are fairly independent. So let's go over quickly the ones for scale presets. So over here you have a button called major, a button called minor, and then 2 buttons here called S1 and S2. These basically give you 4 banks of 12 scales each. Major gives you a bank of 12 major scales, 1 for each root note. So to select a scale, you push major, and then you select a root note, and then you get the major scale for that note. Similarly for minor, you pick minor, pick a root note, and then you get that scale. S1 and S2 are user banks, so you actually have 24 different custom scales that you can define here, 12 per bank. So you can select S1, pick which one you want. And right now by default, a bunch of them are loaded with all the notes on, so just the chromatic scale. But you can save your own scales and even switch between them with the CV input here. Below that, we have a reset and record button. The record button, as I mentioned before, this quantizer has a little feature where you can actually record up to 512 different notes, and they're going to be clocked with this clock input here. So when you push record once, it starts recording. You push record again, it starts playing back. You push it again, and it turns it off. The reset has different purposes. While it's playing or recording, you can push reset to reset back to the first step. Or you can use reset to actually reboot the whole module and reset all the properties if you hold it for a few seconds and then all the lights go off and it reboots. This is also how you can update the firmware. So there's actually a USB drive or USB port on the back of the modules. You have to pull it out, put a USB key in there, and then if you hold reset, it'll reset and then install the latest firmware that way. And finally, we have these last two buttons here. One of them is labeled clear, and this allows you to clear all the notes that you've recorded by holding clear for a few seconds. And finally, we have a force 0 volt, and this is used to calibrate with an oscillator. So when you push force 0 volt, all the lights go off, the quantizer gets turned off, and 0 volts gets output from the 1 volt per octave. So basically, you can patch this into an oscillator, hit force 0 volts, tune your oscillator to like a C or something, and then press 0 volts again, and then you'll be starting from C and then having 5 octaves above that, depending on what you have set here. Right, now that we have that out of the way, let's start building a little patches and demos, and I'll explain how things work as we go. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is calibrate this oscillator here. So I'm going to plug out the volt per octave into the volt per octave input of the oscillator. I'm going to hit force 0 volt. That's going to turn it into 0 volt output here. And then I'm just going to pick 64 hertz here, which will give me C2. And I'll put force 0 volts again, and now we've calibrated. So I'll leave this plugged in because I want to control this oscillator here. If I bring this up, you can hear right now it's just playing a static note. So the first thing I'm going to demonstrate is playing the keyboard here without anything input here. So to do that, you can cycle through the keyboard options here. And the first option is keys, and this turns this keyboard into a playback device. So if I bring this up. So the other thing we can do now, you notice that I'm on the lowest octave. I can set my slider to control the octave by doing a similar procedure, toggling the slider options here till I get to octave. And now you can see the octave LEDs here are changing with the slider. So now if I bring this up. And this allows you to play notes without having to have any input going in here. So playing the little keyboard here is fun and convenient, but the real purpose of this quantizer module is to quantize CV signals that you have coming from other places. So I'm just going to patch in a CV signal from this sequencer here. And as you can hear, all the notes, even though here they're just kind of continuous voltages that are set arbitrarily, they all get quantized into a C major scale, which is what I have selected now. And you can see by the red LEDs indicate what the current note is being played, and then the octave LED tells you what octave is currently being played. And the green LEDs indicate what notes in the scale are going to be quantized. So what this means is that when a note comes in, the only notes that'll come out are the ones that are indicated in green here. So for example, if you play a G flat, which is not selected here, it'll pick the closest value, which is in the scale that I have selected here. So this is a good time to demonstrate the second mode of the keyboard here. So we demonstrated the keys mode. The next one in line is scale edit. And now I can actually edit the scale, so the green lights, I can toggle them on and off, and this determines what notes will be available to be played back. So if I bring this back up, if I remove some of the notes, it'll limit the options. So right now I've only left a C and a G, so regardless of what voltage is coming in here, the only notes that are going to be output are C and G. But obviously they can be output at any of the 5 octaves. So I can start adding more notes. I've added an E, so now we have the root, 3rd, and 5th. The next option for the keyboard mode here is transpose, so let's go to that. So transpose is relative, so starting from the C note, depending on which note you pick, that's how many semitones will be transposed. So for example, if I press a D now, it will get transposed up 2 semitones. So now I have a root, major 3rd, and 5th of the D scale. So if I unplug my CV source for now, let's go back to just the standard quantizer here with no inputs. And now we can demonstrate the slider settings here. So if I set slider to notes, then this slider here will control what note is being played. And as you can see, the notes are quantized as well, so I still have the C, E, and G selected, so those are the only notes being played. So if I bring the keyboard mode back to scale edit, I can add additional notes. And now when I swipe through, you'll get the entire C major scale. And it goes across all 5 octaves. So now let's bring back the CV input here and we'll demonstrate some of the other slider settings we have. One of which is portamento. So if we go to portamento, this slider will determine the lag between 2 different notes. It's important to note that the quantizer gets turned off when you have portamento enabled, and it's going to be doing a best guess at as it slides from one note to another to approximate a quantized note. But the more you add slew or the more portamento you have, the less precise the notes will be. So if I increase it, so as you can hear, when I exaggerate portamento, it gets a little pitchy, but still a cool effect to have. Then next in line here we have transpose, so I can actually use the slider to transpose the notes, or the scale rather. And finally I can turn the slider into an octave selector. So it's important to keep in mind that this selects the bass octave. So if your CV inputs here go way beyond that octave, you might run out of range. So if I pick the last octave, we basically run out of notes, because there's nowhere higher to go. So it's a little more useful if the CV inputs you have are contained within 1 octave. Then you can really shift between. But if your CV inputs span a range of 5 octaves, then you risk cutting off your total range as you increase the octave here. So let's quickly demonstrate recording. So for recording, you need to have something plugged into the clock input, otherwise there's nothing to clock the steps of the recording. So I'm just gonna feed another clock source coming out of the tempi here. I'm gonna pick the same clock source as we have clocking everything else. So the way it works is that as soon as I press record, it's gonna start recording, and it's gonna turn it into a mode where these notes here, I can play them by hand, and this will become an octave selector. So you can kind of play melodies with switching the octave and playing notes here, and then you push record again to stop recording, and it's going to go into playback mode. It's going to start playing the melody. So I'm going to hit record now. And now it's playing back the melody I played. So it's actually going to keep going forever. It's not going to loop until it gets a reset signal. So as you see now, it's stopped playing, so it's not actually looping through. So you can set a reset signal into the CV input here, or you can push the reset button manually here, and that restarts the melody again. And then you can push record again to get out of play mode, and then you're back to just normal mode. And if you hold clear for a few seconds, the lights go off, and then you've cleared the whatever you had stored in the memory. The other thing we can cover is picking different scales. So if you remember when we went through the overview, I mentioned this major, minor, S1, S2. So the way that works is you push the major or minor, and then you pick a root note. So for example, now we basically have C major, so I can pick major, E, and now we're in E major. Or let's go to like F minor, so I press minor, F, now we're in F minor. And similarly, we can pick the two user banks by pushing S1 and then picking one of the slots here. So I push S1. Right now they all have the chromatic scale stored, so this is a good time to go into how you save custom scales. So now I'm in S1, so I can go to Scale Edit in the keyboard mode here, which puts me in this Edit menu. And now let's say we'll just pick some random scale here, which has 1, 1, and 1, 1. So now that's stored in S1 in the first slot. But if you don't actually save it, it will get lost when you power the module off. So the way to save it is to select the Save option, and that brings us into this input range menu here, which we've been avoiding so far. So let's get into that right now. So when you select input range here, this turns into a menu selector, and then you can read these little labels on the left here. So at a super high level, I'm just going to glance over them, and then we'll go over what they actually do. So here we have save and load. This allows you to save and load scales from the EEPROM memory. And this is important. You need to actually save your scales if you want them to persist when the machine boots up. Below that, we have this trig option. When this is on, quantization will only happen when you send a trigger on the clock input. So this is useful if you want to synchronize to something melodic that is happening in the background. So you don't want your quantization to happen instantly. You want it to hold notes and then only quantize on some kind of rhythm based on the clock. This key cue here switches between 16th note quantization or full resolution quantization. The G key here switches between the different modes of the scale CV input. So you can have the scale CV input either control the transpose, or you can have it control a scale. So it'll pick one of the 12 scales based on the current bank you have selected. So below that, you have 4 different settings that control how the clock input behaves, so how the sync works. So by default, you have 16th notes syncing, which is the standard setting. Below that, you have DIN sync, which is useful for the old TR-808 from Roland and stuff like that. Then you have a DAW sync, which is more applicable to a clock signal coming from a workstation software. And then you have sync bus, which is a TipTop proprietary syncing that happens on the bus underneath the module, and that you could connect to other TipTop audio modules. I don't have that selected right now, but for example, if you had a circadian rhythm, you can collect that implicitly underneath and have them sync up automatically. And then finally, we have these 3 voltage ranges for the CV input. So you can have it go from -5 to 5 volts, 0 to 5, or 0 to 10, depending again on the CV source you have coming in. And once we're in this input range menu, all you have to do is push these buttons to make these changes. So for example, if I wanted a DAW sync and I wanted 0 to 5 volts, I could just push that there. So I'll put it back to 0 to 10 and 16th notes. And some of these are toggle options. So you sort of have to reference the manual at the beginning, but then you get kind of used to it and it's not so bad. So again, to save a scale that you've customized, you just go to the input range and hit the save button up here. So while we're here, let's demonstrate triggered quantization. So if I turn off the clock or remove the clock signal here, if I turn on trig quantization, you'll notice it stopped quantizing. So now every time it gets a clock, that's when it'll quantize. So right now it's less interesting because I'm feeding the exact same clock as I am for the sequencer. So you're not going to hear a difference. But if I plug in a different gate source here from the tempi, something at a different tempo, then we'll notice how the trigger happens only when this other gate fires, or the quantization happens rather. So you can see the light here is this gate that I'm feeding here, and that determines when quantization happens. So I can tap tempo this, or I can make it really slow. And then you can turn off trig quantization here, and then it's back to normal. And then let's demonstrate the CV input here. So I'm going to feed one of the LFOs from the mutable peaks here into here, and that'll serve to transpose the track depending on the CV signal. In order to do that, I'm going to go to the input range and make sure G is turned off, which makes the CV scale input control the transposition. So now if I bring this up, I'm going to feed the first LFO here into my CV scale input. And you can hear there, it's changing the transposition of the quantizer when this LFO goes up and down. And if I toggle G on, then it becomes scale picking based on the CV signal. Of course, it's a little less musical when you have an LFO patched in, because normally you don't want your scale to be transposed continuously like that. But you can imagine having something like a touch controller or some kind of manually triggered gate signal, and then you can program it to basically change keys as you're playing a song or something like that. So I'm just going to kind of jam around and patch things randomly and give you some other ideas of how to use this. And of course, right now I'm just feeding it standard sequencer output, but you can patch any kind of control voltage, and that's where the fun of a quantizer comes in, is where you would normally have seemingly chaotic voltage, you can turn it into something musical. So for example, I can use a fairly complex LFO here from the maths, turn it into cycle mode, and just to demonstrate, let's see what would happen if I patch this directly into the oscillator. It's kind of a cool sound effect, but it's not very musical. So now if I run this through the quantizer instead, you get sort of like an auto-tune effect because all the voltages are being mapped to certain values. And I can edit the scale to have less notes in there, even just a single note. So you get nice arpeggiator style effects. I can use the end of rise here to control the envelope generator instead. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what the quantizer can do. It's a fairly straightforward module if you just want the basics, and then there's a few kind of enhancements and menus that unlock other kinds of features that help either with performance with the slider or just tweaking different settings depending on how you're integrating with other systems. So it's fairly flexible for different kinds of syncing with different systems. And yeah, that's basically it. So hopefully this was enjoyable and instructional and informational. If you like this kind of stuff, make sure to leave me a like and subscribe if you want. I'm going to be making lots more Eurorack tutorials and just general patch making videos and music videos and all kinds of cool stuff. And I'll see you guys in the next one.